Hello, 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 and thank you all so much for joining us here. This is Interrobang Books, having the pleasure and the honor of hosting Dr. Stephanie Swales with her second book here tonight with Psychoanalyzing Ambivalence with Freud and Lacan, on and off the couch. Now, before we get to Dr. Swales, who I know everybody is just jonesing and looking forward to seeing, I want to take a brief moment here and discuss Interrobang Books. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, or even for our long-term returners and followers, I wanted to remind you guys that Interrobang Books is an independent bookstore in Dallas, Texas. We do have a brick and mortar shop at 5600 West Lovers Lane, Suite 142, Dallas, Texas 75209. And we'd love to see you come on in if you're able to. Our hours are Monday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And on Sundays, we are open 11 to 6. We are, of course, asking, as all Dallas County stores are, that everybody who comes in covers their mouth and nose with a mask. Just keep us all safe, both our customers and our staff. We are practicing social distancing within the store, and we understand that if you're not comfortable coming into the store, but we are still happy to assist you in any way we can. We do ship books to folks' homes and businesses, and you can also select for curbside pickup, and we will bring it right out to your car, masked up all ourselves. So, wanted to let folks know that they've got lots of options for supporting Interrobang Books. I'll especially say that we've got some copies of Psychoanalyzing Ambivalence with Freud and Lacan, and you should definitely pick up your copy from us, either online at that link that I dropped down. If you're on Facebook, the link is at the top of the stream. If you're on the webinar with me, then just I'll drop it into the chat a little bit later. But you can also just go to interrobangbooks.com, type in the title, and purchase it online. When we open up tomorrow at 10 a.m., you're also welcome to this call. We've got lots of copies, and we would love to sell them to you because we think, frankly, they say a whole lot, but we think folks should know about. Now, I've spoken for a little moment here. I'll say one last thing I'll touch on is if you've got questions for our author, please do. You can drop your questions down below in the comment section or in the Q&A feature on the webinar. So go right ahead and do that whenever you think of them. That way we can get them lined up and start peppering our author with questions. Now, I've spoken for far too long, but I'm going to turn it over to Lori Amon, who's with the Psychoanalytic Center of Dallas. Thanking her so much for coming and joining us this evening. Lori, please take it away.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for your support to the Psychoanalytic Center, and we want to support you. So. But tonight, it's my treat to present Dr. Stephanie Swales. And not only is she a licensed clinical psychologist, but some of you also know her as a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And still others, I think, know you as a treasured associate professor of psychology at the University of Dallas. Undoubtedly, Dr. Swales is a hidden gem in our Metroplex with a prestigious corpus of peer-reviewed journal articles, conference presentations, podcast interviews, as well as authoring 2 books. So thank you, Dr. Swales, for your generosity in revealing to us an insider's view on your recent book, co-authored with Carol Ellens, entitled, as Tom shared with us, Psychoanalyzing Ambivalence with Freud and Lacan, on and off the couch. Everyone's heard of Freud, but Lacan, he's mostly known in the theoretical fields of philosophy, linguistics, literature, and psychology. Can you share with us a little bit about what captured your dedication to his ideologies?
Sure, and thanks, Lori, so much, and thanks to Tom and Interrobang, my favorite local bookstore. So Lacan, I really was attracted to initially for his very close reading of Freud and his innovative way of conceptualizing Freudian psychoanalysis, which takes into account multiple sources from philosophy and from linguistics. Lacan is a very well-read scholar, if nothing else, highly elusive, and ALLUSIVE as well as ELUSIVE. He has a reputation for being a bit hard to crack into, but once you do, I find him to be very clinically relevant as well. And as a clinician, I appreciate how putting his theory into practice works.
Yeah, and so I understand this isn't your first book. This is the second book. And so your first book, entitled Perversion, a Lacanian psychoanalytic approach to the subject, does just what you were saying, brings in clinical material of how to use Lacanian ideas in treatment. And so could you share with us maybe a little bit about what your next project is?
Sure. I'm currently working on a psychoanalytic approach to empathy. And it's both from the perspective of what works in clinical work and analytic work, what types of empathy are embodied most fruitfully by the therapist, by the analyst, and also taking a look at what works and what doesn't work, how empathy can fail us at the larger social, cultural level. There's been talk for many years, especially recently, about, if only we had more empathy, then, the world would be a better, happier place, and we'd have less racism and things like that. And so, my book complicates that a bit.
As I bet today's talk will as well. So
you were right.
So I'm gonna let you proceed because I'm eager to hear. You explained to us more about xenophobia and racism in our culture today. So take it away, Steph.
Thanks, Lori. All right. So Carol Owens is my good friend and colleague and co-author. And it seems to us that nowadays experiences of ambivalence and of the tensions of ambivalence are increasingly foreclosed or radically rejected from our awareness. We are, it appears, no longer expected to be in or of two minds about anything. Not only are we not expected to be ambivalent about figures, objects, or places in our lives, but in fact, it's as if ambivalence itself has become an unsuitable psychical position or experience. Being ambivalent is increasingly and rather negatively interpreted for what it belies, which is a less than unitary or singular response to someone or something. But as psychoanalyst Adam Phillips remarks, we can be ambivalent about anyone or anything. Our ambivalence, in fact, reveals what matters to us. And indeed, it's often the way that we recognize that someone or something has become significant to us. I love you to death and I love you to pieces are two everyday phrases that perfectly evoke the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's statement from his 20th seminar that, quote, "Analysis reminds us that one knows nothing of love without hate," end quote. And perhaps ironically, but not surprisingly, someone who says, "I love you to death," is most often unaware of the hatred implied in such a statement. Ambivalence, or to use the term Lacan preferred, enamoration, which is a neologism combining the French word for hate with the French word for loving, so hate loving. Ambivalence is the cornerstone of psychoanalysis for the very reason that psychoanalysis posits a subject who is fundamentally split by language into conscious and unconscious processes. So far from being about mixed feelings, as Freud explained the concept in his paper Totem and Taboo, ambivalence involves the conflict between two equally strong currents that are, quote, localized in the subject's mind in a way that they cannot come up against each other, end quote. So when one current, one stream of thought is conscious, the other is unconscious. So to have an unconscious in these terms, therefore, is at one and the same time to be ambivalent. So for the rest of this talk, I'll draw from material from the last 2 chapters of our book, which show how ambivalence can shed light on xenophobia, or the fear of our neighbor who might be different from ourselves by virtue of race, gender, sexuality, religion, culture, class, and so on. So in Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, he critically examines the Judeo-Christian dictate, love thy neighbor as thyself. Freud asserted that although people would prefer to view themselves as, quote, gentle creatures who want to be loved, end quote, the truth that they disavow is that they are also aggressive beings, such that men are wolves to each other. Further, we can take from Freud's account of the vicious, punitive nature of the superego that we're actually not so great at loving ourselves, that we hate ourselves just as we love ourselves. So it might be more correct to command, hate thy neighbor as thyself. I'll let you read that. So we are fundamentally ambivalent creatures then. We're ambivalent about ourselves as well as about our neighbors. And therefore, any account of forms of xenophobia, including racism, must take into account our ambivalent human nature. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, one of Freud's papers, Freud remarked that the social bond is solidified by its shared hatred of another group, of the outsider. This libidinally invested group identification makes a distinction between us and them. And the foundational distinction between us and them is to say that we are human and those other people there, they're inhuman. So racism then is often underpinned by comparing those in the other group to animals. In this vein, consider a key scene in Swedish director Ruben Östlund's 2017 film, The Square. The scene depicts a piece of entertainment for invited patrons of the arts seated at a sumptuous banquet hall. And this hall is none other than the Hall of Mirrors at the Grand Hotel in Stockholm, where the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony is held. Sorry about that.
Sorry, Dr. Swales, the sound didn't quite come through.
Okay. So the actor's remit was to enter the hall, chase out the alpha male, and mate with the prettiest woman in the room. After this, we see an excruciatingly long scene in which he has pulled the woman's hair and dragged her onto the floor beneath him, attempting to rape her. And a number of male guests finally charge on him, trying to pull him off. But up until that point, the couple hundred or so guests avert their eyes or smile uncomfortably as the actor Terry Notary's ape man grunts, leers, and pummels his chest, secure in the knowledge that this is but a curious and ironic piece of entertainment, indicating nothing other than humankind's progression. The ape man's behavior contrasting starkly with the high culture setting and its most sophisticated inhabitants. The director's quip, quote, "The idea of it basically is that we're all animals," end quote. This speaks somewhat to what Jacques Derrida called the, quote, "immense disavowal whose logic traverses the whole history of humanity," end quote. A disavowal of the strange beast at the core of human subjectivity, that animal which Derrida notes Socrates was not averse to knowing in himself. So reading Derrida with Lacan, we can say that speciesism is the paradigmatic disavowal upon which human identity is based, and that in order for any type of xenophobia to begin to be overcome by the subject, it's necessary to begin to accept the strange beast in oneself. As I will argue, this means we must accept the seemingly foreign, extimate, libidinal enjoyment or jouissance of the other in ourselves. So what kind of a phobia is xenophobia? The fear of strangers, the fear of the foreigner. According to Lacan, a phobia can serve a developmental function. The phobic object serves to protect a child, since it's a way to symbolize the lack or the desire of the mother, who's occupying the role of obviously parental figure, someone who is seen as a symbolic authority. So this phobic object, again, serves to protect a child, since it's a way to symbolize the lack or desire of the mother, a lack which, unnamed, runs the risk of being interpreted as a devouring demand for the child, that she wants only the child. She doesn't have any other desires in life. So we can think here of common childhood phobias such as witches or wolves, or even in recent horror movies, a creature who eats children and takes on whatever form that each child fears the most. The phobia fixes the child's generalized anxiety onto a specific feared object, one that names the mother or lack, rendering it less menacing in the process. The phobic object, the witch, for instance, stands in for the mother's lack. So by avoiding the witch, the child gets some respite from her or his anxiety, which is ultimately about being engulfed by the other. And this can pave the way for attaining some subjective space to develop one's own desire. Once the child becomes a neurotic subject, which for Lacan is more of a personality position, a way of relating to others, to language. It's not an insult. So once the child becomes a subject, she becomes troubled by her own lack. And for Lacan, there are two faces of lack. One seen through the lens of desire, and the other through the lens of jouissance, or libidinal enjoyment, kind of bodily enjoyment. Our lack at the level of desire translates to various ways in which we feel insufficient, undeserving of love or praise. Our lack at the level of libido, or jouissance, has to do with the fact that we have gone through the process of castration. In other words, via castration, which is a social process, not a literal one, we have sacrificed the so-called instinctual pleasures of, whatever we might want, very young infants. We've sacrificed those in favor of attaining a position in the social order, in favor of being able to get along with others, sharing, so on and so forth. And once we make this sacrifice, we forever feel that we got the bum end of the deal, that symbolic success, praise, and so on just don't make up for the pleasures we have lost. We have many defenses against recognizing the fact of our castration, that this lack of jouissance is a permanent feature of ourselves. Instead, finding ways to fantasize that if only we were able to achieve this or that success, or obtain this or that item, or to retire, etc., then we would be truly and fully happy. And so a phobia for a young child is a way to relieve anxiety about the other's lack, whereas for children and adults who have passed through the castration complex and become neurotically structured, for them phobias, including forms of xenophobia, can function to plug up both our own lack and the other's lack. They can function to help us pretend that we aren't lacking. In other words, Carol and I see xenophobia in adults as being related to the difficulties of accepting our castration, and of very much having to do with feeling we are lacking in jouissance and pleasure. Jouissance is akin to Freud's concept of libido, and it means the particular manner in which someone enjoys or gets off. It's usually not just, enjoying a nice cup of tea. It's a bit more of a state of arousal, embodied pleasure, agitation, enjoyment in that sense. And so it's not unconscious, although it can absolutely be denied or misrecognized. So for example, we might not realize that we're getting some satisfaction when we complain. The thrill of jouissance involved in xenophobia makes it hard to relinquish, as it's much more satisfying than the pleasures associated with empathy, acceptance, and so on. And it's worth noting that being someone who identifies as accepting of all types of people can actually serve to make illicit thoughts of fear and hatred all the more jouissance-inducing. Jouissance is often elicited through doing or thinking what one should not, which is to say that jouissance is frequently transgressive and is structured in opposition to symbolic law. So we all have trouble with xenophobia, both at the level of jouissance and at the levels of structural racism and xenophobia. Not only do we derive jouissance from our xenophobia, but we hate our denigrated neighbors on the basis of their jouissance, their modes of enjoyment. Lacan pointed out that the fear and hatred of the other that we see in xenophobia is not grounded in the signifier. It's not grounded in words and meaning, which is to say it's not based on this or that stereotype or slander. We can see this demonstrated, for instance, in contradictory judgments about the figure of the immigrant. On the one hand, this idea that the immigrant is lazy, wanting to leech off of the American government, and somehow at the same time stealing American jobs away from rightful citizens. So in other words, xenophobia can't be logically explained away. So intelligent, educated people still are subject to xenophobia. So instead, according to Lacan, what's central in xenophobia is the other person's jouissance. As philosopher Slavoj Žižek put it, we perceive the other as having, quote, access to some secret, perverse enjoyment. In short, what gets on our nerves, what really bothers us about the other, is the peculiar way he organizes his enjoyment. The smell of his food, his noisy songs and dances, his strange manners, his attitudes to work, end quote. Individual modes of jouissance are markers of identity, as are normative forms of jouissance associated with a particular cultural group. Of course, in reality, no group of individuals all share a common jouissance, but instead, what is at play in a particular xenophobic person is a particular xenophobic person's fantasy of the jouissance of the figure of the denigrated other. For instance, Sheldon George, in his 2016 book, pointed out that the motivating factor behind white Michael Dunn's 2012 killing of black Jordan Davis at a gas station was that Davis refused to turn down the volume of the rap music in his car. Dunn fired not 1, but 10 bullets into Davis's car in response to Davis deriving jouissance from rap music. Something Dunn later rationalized by saying, quote, "I'm really not prejudiced about race, but I have no use for certain cultures. This gangster rap, ghetto talking thug culture that certain segments of society flock to is intolerable. They espouse violence and disrespect toward women," end quote. So we can see in Dunn's comment his absurdly ironic logic that he, someone who murdered Davis and could have murdered the others who had been in the car, actually stands on the moral high ground as someone whose intolerance is not racist, but instead an intolerance of violence. In fact, Carol and I argue that what is hated of the other's jouissance reveals something about one's own jouissance. So violence, disrespect toward women, the loud rap music at the scene of the murder, as well as what Dunn called the, quote, ghetto talking thug culture, end quote, are all matters of jouissance, of the jouissance Dunn affixes to Black people. So this again is his fantasy of the Black other's jouissance rather than something objectively true about all Black people as a group. The idea that what we hate of the other's jouissance is revealing of our own jouissance demonstrates Lacan's concept of extimacy, whereby what's most intimate in the subject is inextricably linked with the other. So our desires are formed by others' desires, modeled after them. Our very egos, our very senses of self are formed through identifications with others. And as Carol and I highlight, our jouissance is formed in relation to others. Extimacy allows us to see that what we believe to be most unique, most intimate to ourselves, has its roots in the other. Via extimacy, the thing I perceive myself as missing, object A in Lacanian terms, is what I locate in the other, in whomever personifies the symbolic other, the authority, or the someone who's very different than myself. As neurotic subjects, our relation to jouissance functions in this manner, since we feel we've had to sacrifice jouissance in order to get along with others, to assume a position in the symbolic or social order. We have a basic resentment on this account, feeling that we ought to be in more possession or in possession of more enjoyment, and that the other has stolen it from us. It's our rightful property, the other's taken it away. And so xenophobia operates through imagining that the denigrated group of people as other have stolen jouissance they don't deserve. And that jouissance is perceived in a kind of exaggerated form as being excessive. They enjoy too much. This is manifestly at work in stereotypes such as the idea that the gay community has too much sex. Via extimacy, those who hold this belief might be revealed to feel they aren't getting enough sex or having unsatisfying sex, and so on. And so in this fashion, extimacy allows us to see that the other jouissance is in fact our own jouissance, rejected into the exterior and perceived in the other person. Our fantasies of the other jouissance come from our experience of our own jouissance, since we can't experience someone else's enjoyment, modes of enjoyment. Jacques-Alain Valère, Lacan's son-in-law, therefore concludes that if on the one side of the coin, xenophobia appears as hatred of the other jouissance, on the other side of the coin, xenophobia is hatred of one's own jouissance. Although the hatred and fear of our jouissance is the motivating force behind its rejection into the other, it's still a cherished part of ourselves that we fight against relinquishing, even if it causes us great turmoil. And we can see this at play in psychoanalytic symptoms, in symptoms that subjects present to us in clinical work. Take, for instance, these derogatory cartoons blaming the outbreak of COVID-19 on a perception of Chinese oral jouissance. Here that they will eat anything, including bats. Xenophobic acts such as these make use of the signifier and the power of the image. A signifier is a word, and they also make use of the power of the image in order to plug in the anxiety-provoking lack in the other. Via extimacy, we can see that the hatred of the Chinese other's jouissance, evident in Xenophobia, actually points to an ambivalence about our own jouissance. Perceiving Chinese jouissance as being highly oral in nature, of course, smacks of our American penchant for overconsumption, about which we certainly have a love-hate relationship. Further, many Americans felt that oral jouissance was in jeopardy at the start of the pandemic, when the grocery shelves were bare and people were restricted from visiting restaurants, from bonding in public spaces over their shared oral jouissance. Often in xenophobia, the denigrated other is perceived as having stolen or threatening to steal that which Derek Hook has termed our libidinal treasures. Jouissance such as the oral jouissance derived from eating and talking in social groups are thus those that we view as central to our own group identity. So not only were our libidinal treasures perceived as stolen by the Chinese on account of the COVID-19 outbreak, but via our extimate ambivalence, we were also confronted with our lack in terms of our jouissance in consumption, shopping as well as eating. And not liking what they saw, some projected that onto the Chinese. And in fact, the Pew Research Center showed that their ongoing poll of Americans' perceptions of Chinese people showed a dramatic decrease in liking Chinese people or Chinese appearing people as a group, and a dramatic uptick in acts of xenophobia against Chinese appearing people. So the subject's fantasy of the other's jouissance as that which elicits anxiety and hatred, as that which makes the other fundamentally different from the subject upon which xenophobia is founded, is in fact the subject's own enjoyment, both loved and hated. As Zizek puts it, quote, "The other's jouissance is insupportable for us because, and insofar as, we cannot find a proper way to relate to our own jouissance, which forever remains an extimate intruder. It is to resolve this deadlock that the subject projects the core of its jouissance onto an other, attributing to this other full access to a consistent jouissance. So since the other is inside of the subject, occupying the place of extimacy, to hate the jouissance that the subject projects into the other, and to love the jouissance, on the other hand, that the subject accepts as its own, is ultimately nothing other than the indexes of the ambivalence about the subject's own jouissance. So in other words, we reject what we hate of ourselves into the other by projection, and we love the jouissance that we actively own as ours, and this is the fundamental index of ambivalence. Hence, xenophobia is linked to what Carol and I call an extimate ambivalence at the heart of being. Denial then of one's own castration is the cause of xenophobic fantasies, which figure a denigrated other as having stolen the object A, the lost object of enjoyment, thus causing the individual's suffering and lack. The phobic solution to the structural lack at the heart of the subject is one which is slowly modified, slowly worked through in a psychoanalytic treatment. At the end of analysis, the subject becomes subjectified lack. In other words, the subject will have taken responsibility for and assumed its own lack, no longer blaming the other. And therefore, in conclusion, I propose that a successfully completed analysis, by definition, involves a reduction in that subject's xenophobia, even if it's not an explicit aim of the work on the part of the patient. Nevertheless, although analysis works on altering the main subjective structural conditions for the possibility of xenophobia, it certainly doesn't eradicate xenophobia in the subject, since to participate in our society is to be racist, sexist, hold fast to various positions of privilege, and so on. To end with a quote by James Baldwin, "The story of the Negro in America is the story of America. It is not a pretty story."
Wow, Dr. Swales, there are so many complex ideas there. I was wondering about going back to the beginning of your talk when you're like introducing the phobic concept. With the child, it's protective, and yet with the adult, there's something about that that's identity forming. Is that how you?
No. So for the child, it's both protective and identity forming. So it helps the child attain a certain personality position in lieu of, it's not every child has a phobic solution to this. And I think probably every child does have phobias. But a phobia for a child names the other's lack as a kind of in-between to understanding that the other, who might be personified by any parental figure, not necessarily just the mother, that the other desires. So to desire for Lacan is to is the essence of what it is to be a human. So he says we are desiring beings, which means that we want this, and then maybe once we get that, if we ever do, then we want something else. We're always desiring more because we are castrated because we're lacking in jouissance at a certain fundamental level. We'll never be completely satisfied or happy. And so once the child realizes this, sometimes through the help of the phobia, the child is able to attain his or her own position as a desiring subject. And so that's a crucial developmental function, actually, a phobia can play for a child. For an adult, it's not about identity anymore. It's about denying that we're lacking, wanting to see ourselves as whole. And so we project our lack onto denigrated others in xenophobia. So we do have anxiety in the face of seeing ourselves as lacking. We don't like that. So we avoid at all costs seeing ourselves as such. And xenophobia is one common way in which we achieve that.
Yeah. Thank you. So
folks, you can ask your questions down below in the Q&A tab down there. Feel free to shoot your questions in and we'll relay them to the authors. But Dr. Swales, I was really curious about the way you looked at xenophobia, and I was hoping you could speak to ways to overcome this. And you spoke a little bit about analysis of it. And I'll be honest, that went a little bit over my head. So I was hoping you could touch on that a little bit more about overcoming xenophobia, since you have so well described the circumstances in which it arises.
So that's the $10 million question. One thing I do want people to take away from this talk is just how intransigent of a problem xenophobia can be. Those of us who are liberal-minded and think of ourselves as very accepting, it's hard to see that insofar as we aren't able to love ourselves, we're also not able to love the other. And on the other hand, in terms of solutions, psychoanalysis is in a unique position to address xenophobia because it helps us deal with the fact that we're lacking, right? It's like, all right, we can't be perfect, so on and so forth. We can't ever, achieve this or that success that'll make us feel, hunky-dory for the rest of our lives. And it's also in a unique position to address xenophobia because it's a process of laying bare our ambivalence about the other. We put it out into the open. You have to say in analysis, whatever comes to mind. That's the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, is no matter how, embarrassing or, ridiculous or seemingly not related or hateful and socially unacceptable it is, you have to say whatever comes into mind. And this, for many people, allows them to basically think and speak things that they had felt in the past, or things that were operating on them at some level that was more symptomatic, and came out a symptom for Lacan and for Freud involves a kind of repression of our ambivalence. It's not quite the best way to put it. And so in this laying bare our ambivalence about the other, we question the whys and wherefores as well of our identifications that we have. We might take some distance from them and question our positions. And so at the end of the analysis, you're going to have less xenophobia for that reason. At the social level, we can say that the structures of capitalism, neoliberalism, revolve around covering over our lack. So the myth of capitalism in today's time, and neoliberalism is another word for that, is that if only we're able to get such and such an object, buy this product, or learn this skill, for instance, empathy. If you read a self-help book on how to be more empathic, whatever, then you will, solve whatever problem you have. You'll feel content, and so capitalism actually helps create via advertising the idea that we're missing something in the first place. And that the perfect solution is this product or this vacation or, this experience. And so under capitalism, we as subjects are especially bad at recognizing and accepting our own lack. And so as such, if racism is a way of covering over that lack, it's especially difficult to relinquish. And so, I realize I'm going on, but, racism necessarily, healing from that involves confronting your subjective lack. And so that does involve some tough steps that not everyone is motivated to take. And even if you are motivated, the psychoanalytic principle here is that we have an unconscious. So, you tell yourself you're going to do something, and then your darn unconscious can get in your way. So I have more thoughts about that, but I'll end there since I see we have a few questions.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed that. So thank you for the response. Jessica asks us, I love your code examples, thank you. How would you describe the Jouissance? I butchered that and I apologize. Of a client who is upset at anti-maskers having no regard for public safety.
Could you say the word you butchered again? I didn't understand it.
Jouissance.
Oh, jouissance. Jouissance. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so we can actually see a kind of maskophobia, you might say, in anti-vaxxers or those who refuse to wear masks. In terms of the mask itself might even be seen as a state of partial face castration, right? You're lacking here. And that in and of itself might arouse some anxiety and hatred. And to Jessica's question, you said anti-vaxxers? Or did I make that up? Anti-maskers, yeah.
Clients who are upset at anti-maskers having no regard for public safety.
Yeah, so the anti-maskers, as such, view themselves as, the government or the liberals have stolen their modes of enjoyment, right? They've stolen our right to, gather in large groups and, have physical contact with each other and go shopping and, eat in public and, wear what we want to wear and not have to wear masks. And, so it's this idea of libidinal treasure comes in there, as well as that the other has stolen our jouissance. So it is a type of xenophobia to blame the liberals. For instance, not that liberals are, get a pass either. We have our ways of hating too.
I am sort of fascinated by that response in part because many of the customers who come into the bookstore who refuse to wear masks and we have sort of heard them out say, oh, it gives me anxiety or makes me very nervous. And I'm fascinated by the way you describe that without having with that for me. I'll say we've got a couple more questions come in. One of our attendees asks, how does fantasy play into xenophobia? Is it also formed by the others, such as Jouissance?
Yeah, another good question. So fantasy is, for Lacan, defined in two ways. One, it is the desire for the object of enjoyment. And the other, it's relation to the object of enjoyment. And so that necessarily, the two of them, go hand in hand, or different sides of the same coin. And the relation to the object of enjoyment involves jouissance, involves libido. And so the structure of fantasy for Lacan is a way to feel whole. So if only we had the object, we would be whole. So that's the kind of fundamental what fantasy does for the subject.
I'm curious, when you talk about the things that cover up what we lack and the things that we sort of think, oh, if I just had that, I'd then be whole. Do you ever find that the sort of social paradigm of how therapy is looked at can be seen as something that fills a hole, even when it's not effective for the individual, or it's perhaps seen as a panacea for all ills?
Absolutely. Perhaps snobbishly, but I have reason to view this from experience. Psychoanalysis is not just another form of therapy. And I do think that typical psychotherapy can be used, not necessarily, but the way in which the therapist-patient relationship is operative in a psychotherapy relationship, cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, is so radically different from what happens in analysis. And it can lend itself. It's easier for someone in therapy versus psychoanalysis to try to use the therapist's advice, for instance, in a way so as to shore up their own lack. Just tell me the right way to think, or how I can correct my cognitive distortions. Cognitive behavior therapy gives homework. If I only do my homework assignment well, then, I'll be healed and I'll be on my way. So I do think psychotherapy has more of a risk of doing that. And so I personally agree. I think that's often the right way to think about therapy, unfortunately. But at the same time, forms of talk therapy other than psychoanalysis, what we're calling psychotherapy, absolutely help people. I'm not claiming that they don't. Any way to ease someone's suffering and help them relate better to their loved ones and to work is fine by me. But psychoanalysis is the best.
To put my simple terms, one of my supervisors stated, I think that you would agree with Dr. Swales that psychoanalysis is about understanding, how you think. And psychotherapy in a CBT form would be more about helping you to think something in particular.
We don't quite have time for me to fully answer that, because I don't agree fully, because for Lacan, it's a particular type of psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. He does emphasize, the importance of knowing something about your unconscious, but he also speaks about the importance of not knowing. Yeah. That there's, and that corresponds to his attunement to jouissance, which at some level is outside of words or meaning. And so for Lacan, if you just wrap it up in a tidy bow for the person, I'm not saying that's what other analysts do, but if the person feels they really understand, they're usually not changing enough.
Well, I know that we all have many things we want to delve into and wish that we could have all the time in the world to do so. But we have come to the conclusion of our event. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us, especially Dr. Swales and Lori. Thank you both. It's been a pleasure to host you this evening.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Lori.
Now, I'll let everybody know that if you would like to purchase a copy of Psychoanalyzing Ambivalence with Freud and Lacan, I've got copies in the bookstore. I've also dropped a link in the chat that you can click on and it'll take you right to my website. You can also go to interrogangbooks.com. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been recorded and we look forward to sharing this with you online. I'll also note, as Lori has thrown this up here, and I'll frankly let Lori speak to this, different ways to connect with the community.
Yes, for those of you who your interest was perked by Dr. Swales, you could be involved in the Dallas Psychoanalytic Center with, we have some now online meetings and training for postgraduates. And then the Dallas Society for Psychoanalytic Psychology has monthly meetings. And this last year, they've been focusing on the theory of Wilfred Bion, which has been very fascinating. So these are two places for you to find out more. Thank
Delightful.
you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Once again, thank you, Dr. Swales, and thank you, Lori. Everybody have a good and safe night. Take good care and pick up a copy of the book tonight.
Thank you, Interrobang.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swales.